Well, to focus a little bit on the city of Johannesburg and discuss the dynamics at play for the political parties in the race for the City of Gold is political analyst Angelo Fick. Angelo, thank you for joining us. Always good to talk to you. It is that time of the year again when we speculate and try and guess what might play out. Did 2016 surprise you in any way when we look back?
I think the surprise of 2016 was the performance of the economic freedom fighters, not necessarily the underperformance of the then governing African National Congress in the city of Johannesburg, nor of the resurgence, or shall we say rise, of the then Democratic Alliance under Mmusi Maimane. I think 2021 may serve some politicians a series of surprises, but some of us have had to become quite cynical and hard-hearted so that we do not become too shocked or surprised by what voters do, since our jobs don't necessarily depend on voters' behavior, unlike political parties and politicians.
You've made a bit of a connection between 2016 and 2021. Let me just start by asking this maybe. Politically, is this the big one to win? Economically, for sure, we know this because of being the economic hub of South Africa. But politically as well, is this an important one to win?
I think for political parties, it's a mixed bag because whoever wins the Johannesburg, the majority in Johannesburg has quite a lot of work ahead of them, work that may not be easy to do and additional challenges which will arise. For the voters, it is certainly a big one because it will determine the direction that their city will take and that the city that we live in is likely to what is likely to unfold for it over the next decade. And this is crucial as we sit at the beginning of this decade because the errors of the past have to be corrected, new errors have to be avoided, and all sorts of very positive decisions have to be made given existing challenges and new challenges. And some of those challenges are unavoidable. They're things like rapid urbanization, which cannot be undone or reversed. And some of them are the challenges that are global in scope, including economic transformation, accommodation of movement of people, and most especially, I think, the climate catastrophe will have to be dealt with, because even though we are not a sea level city, all sorts of problems are likely to arise for Johannesburg over the next 10 to 20 years.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more about the issues just now. The election results of 2016, as you said, the EFF were in the ascendancy, and I wonder if there's any reason to doubt that their curve will continue to rise, and the ANC's was in decline. And have they done enough in the interim to perhaps either steady the ship or reverse the decline? What are your thoughts? Because we also have now in the mix a good number of independents that weren't in the mix before.
So everything is going to turn on turnout. How many people stand up and get themselves to the voting booths on the day or on the special days before will determine whether parties perform as well as they imagine they will or as badly as many observers imagine they will. What's also crucial here is to bear in mind the great distrust in political institutions and in the social institutions of contemporary South Africa by many of its citizens and the people who live here. And political parties and the electoral system, we will see on the 1st of November whether people have lost trust in the electoral system to the extent that they've declared. We know that voter turnout is generally lower for local government elections, and that's partly tragic because local government issues are so much more important and immediate for ordinary people than the national issues, which often have a much broader scope and often much more beyond the control of ordinary people living in neighborhoods. And so one would hope that over the next decade we start agitating younger people to be more participate in a more sort of, shall we say, active way in local government elections. And also to participate in the processes that follow from local government elections in the public participation processes of government. As for the EFF, my imagination or my sense is that the imagination that they will continue to improve is likely to be affected by perceptions of their own role in the VBS scandal, their rhetoric over the last couple of weeks. As for the African National Congress, I think, its record since 2016 is clear. As the report in Griselda Lewis, as people reported in Griselda Lewis's piece, the corruption continues, the maladministration continues, and some of those challenges were inherited, but they simply haven't been dealt with. Aging infrastructure, which causes electricity interruptions, aging infrastructure of the water supply system, really outdated water supply into suburbs that uses the same quality of water for all functions in a country that is, water scarce and will soon be even more prone to water scarcity because of the climate catastrophe. And that those kinds of challenges should have been addressed over the last 25 years, at least over the last 10 years. They haven't. And one hasn't heard from the governing party any kind of vision about how they're going to address this to ensure that there isn't further collapse of the infrastructure. Those of us who live in the comfortable north don't have the challenges of the people of the south, but we certainly have challenges around failing substations. The failures of the Sydney power station have caused interruptions across the north of Johannesburg on a fairly regular basis that is truly unacceptable if you're going to think of local government growth, of the economic opportunities for smaller businesses, because they get affected by these power interruptions. And so one has to be really honest, and that the African National Congress's record in government is not a good one at local government level in Johannesburg. We live in a city that is over 130 years old and seems to show the age with crumbling infrastructure, a crumbling city centre that hasn't been revived, except in some very superficial ways. And to some extent, local government legislation was meant to undo the spatial logics of apartheid and colonialism. And Johannesburg may have done somewhat more than other large cities in South Africa, but it still is not enough. We remain a city of divisions that almost map very easily class and race in the old ways, that don't really address what should have been done by the ANC, given that it had both national and provincial and certain municipal power for substantial stretches of the last 10 years.
What about the new players like Herman Mashaba and the independents? Might we see a record number of independent councillors sitting in council this year?
We may, but that again depends on turnout, whether the people in the boards that those people are standing for turn out for those independent candidates. And that really is something that voters have to take seriously. And this doesn't mean that any independent trumps any political party. It is important for voters to realize that as citizens, as people who live in a particular ward, their engagement has to be thoroughgoing and ongoing. It cannot simply be a ballot marked on a particular day. In the lead up to these elections, people have to, interrogate what the candidates stand for. And there are online sources for the middle classes and people with access to data to get that information. Open Labs is part of that process. And then, after the election, should their candidates get in, to keep hammering them to get, answers to their questions. That was a bit of a Freudian slip, hammering. But I think it's important for people to realize that democratic processes have to be participatory from both sides. And so far, we are okay with running the checks and balances on representative democracy, but it's the qualitative difference that participative democracy can make that I think citizens have to be brought on board for. As for Action South Africa and Herman Mashaba, my sense is that he speaks in the rhetoric that may be popular at the moment and populist in some senses. And there is a role for the popular in politics, that's undeniable. But we should also be aware that some of the statements made by politicians are really about much more exploitative use of people's emotions to get them to vote for them in order to gain power. But the reality is that those politicians' statements often don't hold pace with the changes that we're seeing in the world. And in a world currently where 1 in every 122 people is alive today is a displaced person, and that number is likely, in fact, guaranteed to increase over the next decade or so, it is impossible to simply have this xenophobic rhetoric that says, migrants and foreigners are the source of our problems, and if we fix that, we'll fix everything else. The people who are corrupt in the municipalities are not migrants, they're South Africans. The people who commit crimes to a large extent are mostly South Africans. The people who don't pay for services are mostly South Africans. The people who litter, because the majority of the people who live in our cities are South Africans. And so this idea that there is a foreign menace and that if we deal with it, everything will fall back into place, that isn't necessarily going to happen. And so many of the politicians' promises this election period have been pie-in-the-sky promises for which there is no budget plan, for which there is no active plan, other than the rhetoric that seems to ignore the fact that there is a constitution, that we have laws, and that there is a material reality and a phenomenal reality in the world for which these solutions seem really not only petty-minded, but actually wholly ineffectual.
What about the Democratic Alliance? Have they been able to reposition themselves post Mmusi Maimane and Herman Mashava?
My sense is that the Democratic Alliance has successfully repositioned itself. Whether that repositioning, in for all its successes, appeals to voters is a different story. Its record with its traditional voter base was marred by all sorts of processes around the way in which Mmusi Maimane was exited from the party and its relocation to the right of its original position, even though it continues to call that position liberalism, or as one regional election manager called it, muscular liberalism. That position, I think, takes its talking points from people like Steve Gorka and Seb Gorka and Steve Bannon, and really are a mix of right-wing Tory points from the UK and Republican far-right Tea Party notions that attack critical race theory, attack all sorts of other changes, and have a kind of campaign that's really about, that would work in a polity like the United States, but doesn't take into account the realities of South Africa. And so it would, I think, strongly call on the people who support that kind of view to vote for it. But those people are, I think, fewer in number than the DA's original voter base in 2016, and certainly even in 2019. And so, if we look at the by-election results, if we look at people's responses and the fiasco and gaffes that the DA has put itself in, one is reminded of Samadoda Fikeni's point that even with the African National Congress in open disarray and in, sort of suicide kamikaze mode, it seems that the Democratic Alliance is quietly sitting in the corner self-harming. And it doesn't help that the figures who come out to speak with these really odd and confrontational slogans that are quite empty. And one thinks here of figures like Helen Ziller, coming out and in her conversation with Rion Vocal, really just, not answering the questions, not opening herself up to accountability, and really citing the least reputable sources on issues to not explain her beliefs and her party's positions.
So one of the things that happens in an election, you look around you, you say there's no service delivery, and then you point a finger at someone, and that's usually the incumbent. Johannesburg is a bit complicated because at one point it was a DA-led coalition, then it swapped hands and it became an ANC-led coalition. So what does the voter do in terms of blame? Because they have to decide, or do they not take that in consideration? How do they figure this out?
Well, that's a tough one because it's also, there are a plethora of very bad choices on many of the wards that I've looked at. And there is a lot of bad faith politics in contemporary South Africa. And so voters have tough choices ahead of them. I think people have to start making very rational choices on what their beliefs are in terms of politics, what their vision is for the future, and what the record of the particular politicians or political parties that they think speak to those visions, what that record is. Because it isn't any longer just about aspirations and promises. That time has gone. The people who have been in government have to explain why they haven't delivered, and so far the explanations have been poor, inadequate, and at times even silly. And the African National Congress has some, explanation to give there, and it hasn't come to the party. It keeps talking about how it's anti-corruption, and then the statistics come out and they bear out everyday experiences by the ordinary people of Johannesburg of just how corrupt the space is. And we as citizens have to do what Jabulo Ndebele asked us to do 15 years ago. He said, stop looking at the next candidate for corruption and ask about the conditions that make corruptibility possible. And there, corporate citizens, as well as ordinary citizens, play a role in it. If you pay a bribe to get your license early, if you jump the queue by paying 50 Rand, you're as complicit and as guilty as the people who, get involved in the PPE scandals. It's a matter of scale difference, but it is the same issue. And I think the crucial issues have to be held in mind by ordinary voters. And when it comes to the ward candidates, the problem is that ward candidates are often where people point their fingers, even though those people, to a large extent, can be very powerless in a system that really foregrounds party demands over ward councillors' aspirations and citizens' demands. So people in a ward, for example, can't easily get rid of a ward councillor, no matter what their underperformance is if the party doesn't agree to it. And if the party wants to get rid of somebody, even if they are an effective ward councillor, there's nothing that the ordinary citizens can do to change that effectively. I mean, there are measures in place, but they're hardly ever used. And even when they're used, parties are quite powerful. And so I suppose citizens have a right to begin to gamble, so to speak, on independent candidates. But those independent candidates themselves have to realize that they're going into party political spaces where they will be the minority voices, even if many of them get voted in, precisely because of the way in which the legislature works, and they would have to pivot their roles in that legislature quite carefully to make sure that, one, they still satisfy their constituents back in the ward, but two, that they maximize the ability to negotiate with the parties what it is that they want done. And this, I think, calls for greater cooperative politics than we've so far seen in our legislatures, because what we've seen is opposition between parties, but not necessarily people working hard together to get precisely all of those services that Griselda spoke of and that the people she interviewed pointed to, working again, because Johannesburg is a wonderful city to live in. If you have certain kind of money and you can privatize those services. It is a horrific space to live in if you're poor and live in the underserviced parts of the city.
All right, we've run out of time and I'm going to get into trouble, but in 30 seconds, if you can answer this question. It's interesting that the mayoral candidates, not everyone has announced them this time around. Is there some logic to that, do you think? Is it about not putting a face of someone who can represent the party, but rather getting people to think about the party rather than the individuals? What do you think it is?
It could be that. It could be that parties hadn't sorted out their internal issues to get a mayoral candidate on paper. Or it could just be the kind of party ineffectiveness that we've seen in this election where parties really haven't understood the process they've signed up for. Could be anything.
All right. Angelo, I am sure we're going to have many conversations over the next couple of weeks. Thanks so much indeed for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, that's one of our regular contributors, Angelo Fick, speaking about the City of Gold, Egoli, plek van goud.